Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Karthick Ramakrishnan. I'm the Executive Director of California 100, and we're excited to launch our first major public event with a timely and future-focused conversation about algorithms, privacy, and the future of technology and tech regulation in California. We have an impressive panel of speakers that'll help us launch into a conversation about how we should be thinking not only about the present moment, how we got here, but importantly, what does this mean moving forward? A lot of the focus will be on algorithms and privacy, but we will also enter into a conversation more generally about the future of science and technology in California. Before we get started into that conversation, I'll just say a little bit about California 100, and then I'll welcome one of our co-sponsors here who will say a few remarks as well. So California 100 is a relatively new initiative that seeks to transform the future of the state. And as the word 100 might imply, we're not just talking about the next 5 years, 10 years, or even the next generation in California. We are concerned and focused on the next century in California. Now, that might sound an impossible task. I'll say, as a political scientist myself who tries to do careful, empirical, rigorous work, thinking that far ahead and trying to project that far ahead may seem like a fool's errand. But we are not about trying to project the future. What we're trying to do is to dream up, build up, and use rigorous research to focus on different scenarios for the future, and to think about the kinds of things that we need to have in place today or in the near term to make sure that we're able to be resilient, adaptive, responsive to whatever comes our way. While we're in the pandemic, I was going to say coming out of the pandemic, we're still, we're not fully out of the pandemic yet. We've seen the importance of being prepared for the unknown, for the unpredictable, and to think about the kinds of policies, practices, investments, changes in mindsets, and not only involving government, but also the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and so many more, to be able to be better prepared for that future. One of the things we say with California 100 is California is often seen as a global leader in innovation. Well, we can't take that for granted. The things that have enabled that innovation over the last several decades or even a century might not be in place, at least in terms of our comparative advantage and competitive advantage into the long-term future. At the same time as we try to be a state of innovation, we also have to be a state of inclusion. This is something that California has done a pretty good job in the last 20 to 30 years. But if you stretch it back to the long history of California for over 100 years ago, that record has not been that great. Well, how do we make sure that as we move ahead into the next century, we remain a state of innovation and a state of inclusion, not only with respect to other states across the country, but to really own our global leadership and the mission we have to make sure that we can be the best, we can do and be the best that we can be when it comes to being a state of innovation and a state of inclusion. So that's a high-level set of framing remarks about California 100 and what we're about. You'll be seeing a lot of us in the coming months and the next year and a half. And I'm just so thrilled to have partners today, including CEPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, who is not only a co-sponsor of this event, but is key to California 100. Our advanced technology stream runs through CEPR at Stanford with Alison Burke as our Director of Technology. And we are very grateful for CEPR for being not only a fiscal home and an intellectual partner for the entire California 100 enterprise, but also to be an event co-sponsor today. Next, I want to turn it over to Christine Sang from Stanford RegLab, who is another co-sponsor for the event today. Christine.
Thanks so much, Karthik. Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Sang, the Executive Director of Stanford RegLab. That's the Regulation, Evaluation, and Governance Lab, where we use data science and machine learning to help build high-impact demonstration projects for a better government. And mostly, I'll keep this short. We just wanted to thank Karthik and the entire California 100 team for putting together this important conversation. And we're thrilled to have the chance to co-sponsor this event and to hear from this exceptional group of experts on questions about technology and regulation that RegLab is very interested in and that will shape the future of California and beyond. And finally, just a warm welcome to everyone for joining us today from near and far. We're really grateful you've made the time in your busy schedules. And thanks so much. Back to you, Karthik.
Thank you, Christine. And speakers, welcome to our first public forum on California 100. I'll just say a little bit about each of these speakers. We could take up a third of our program just reading their bios. So I'm going to spare you that. So in the order in which we'll be teeing up the questions, first we have Ernestine Fu, who is a commissioner on California 100 with a focus on advanced technology. She's a Stanford alum, triply defined, and is also a venture partner at Alsop Louie. After that, we have Jeremy Weinstein, who is the co-author of the recent book, System Error, and I have that book here with me, and he's co-author with Rob Reish and Maran Sahami, all three of them professors at Stanford who co-taught a class together that inspired the creation of that book. Jeremy is also a professor of political science and the founder of Stanford Impact Labs. And then finally, we have Jennifer Urban, who's a clinical professor of law at Berkeley, as well as the chair of the California Privacy Protection Agency. So speakers, we have a lot of ground to cover. And before we really get into thinking about all the policy considerations as it involves algorithms and about maybe current regulation and the future of regulation and what that might mean, I'd like to level set in terms of what do we mean by algorithms, right? Some of us may have seen movies recently that have primed algorithms, say in when it comes to social media applications, or we think about algorithms when it comes to real estate. So I'm going to first toss it over to Ernestine Fu, who among the speakers are arguably maybe is the closest to industry and what an industry perspective might look like when it comes to algorithms. So Ernestine, just kind of enter us into a conversation. At least, how do you, when you think about algorithms, when you hear algorithms, what do you think it's important for people to have in mind when we enter into these conversations?
Mm-hmm. Sure thing. Thanks for having me on this panel, Karthik. So algorithms, at the end of the day, the way I view it is it's basically just a set of instructions designed to perform a specific task. So you can think of AI as a type of algorithm that tells a computer how to learn, how to operate on its own, and AI technology allows a machine to simulate human behavior. An important part of enabling that is the use of data. I think we'll probably talk a lot about data today, and not just data in general, but the data quality I think is really important to consider. So I think it's not just about quantity, but quality in terms of you don't want noisy or extra data that doesn't help inform learning algorithms or decision makers. There's, of course, lots of exciting applications of having data and really smart algorithms. Just think of it from our day-to-day lives. Smart cities is a future that I think we'll encounter, and you can imagine that with data and algorithms, we can have smart traffic lights that help with giving route suggestions to reduce traffic congestion. You can have data and algorithms measure building energy usage to help the grid operate more efficiently. You could imagine weather data, also guiding the placement of wind turbines, solar panels, and whatnot. But then, of course, there's also a number of downsides, and we've already seen that play out in a number of different cases when we think about, for instance, like biases in algorithms with, I can just think of housing as one example. So access to housing, huge national issue. You have lenders, landlords, brokers using algorithms to decide whether to approve or deny loan applications or rental applications. But then a lot of times the data used to train those algorithms could be historical data, geographic data, can result in biases against certain racial groups or socioeconomic groups.
Thank you, Ernestine. So maybe one takeaway I get from that is that algorithms might improve the efficiency in a dramatic way, but it might actually worsen or maybe preserve or maybe worsen problems of equity if by being efficient you're becoming really efficient on an inequitable foundation. Thank you for flagging that, and I'll come back to you later, right, in terms of not just in algorithms, but also other aspects of science and technology that we need to be thinking about in terms of a long-term, innovative, and equitable future. Jeremy, welcome to California 100. Ernestine's kind of teed it up a little bit. You have a significant chapter in your book where you talk about algorithms. We don't have time for you to go through that entire chapter, but what should we be thinking about from a public policy and an ethical perspective when it comes to algorithms and their use?
Thanks, Karthik, and it's so great to be here with these speakers and also in the context of the California 100 discussion, which I think is a really ambitious and important effort to think not about the next 5 years, but really about decades in the future and the kind of state that we want to live in. Karthik, I want to put algorithms in a slightly broader context before I walk you through some of the details on algorithms, which is just to say that we're at a moment where the fact that technology realizes for us extraordinary benefits, but also generates social harms, is unavoidable. Everyone is now deeply aware of that reality. And we see it in the context of algorithms, but also more broadly. So many of these things have even played out in ballot propositions for voters in California, whether it's around transformation in the criminal justice system and the use of algorithmic decision-making, or whether it's around the future of the gig economy. The question of how to get the benefits of technology while also mitigating potential harms is at the forefront of the questions that Californians need to confront. And I think in our own teaching and our own writing, part of what we've really tried to lift up is the reality that as technologies are built, they encode a set of choices and they encode a set of values. And often the values that are encoded in each technology are in some way in tension with other values that we may hold socially. And in a world in which technology is built and imagined and created and rolled out largely by people who work inside companies and people who run companies and finance companies, the question of where to referee these value trade-offs is a big, open, and important question that we need to address in our regulatory future. And so we can look at this through the lens of algorithms, but the important argument that we make in our book is that the challenges that we're confronting with these social harms have three common roots. The first is that most technologies are built around some sort of optimization mindset, that there's an end goal that is motivating the technology and that is the objective function chosen by the technologists themselves, and that optimization mindset often blinds us to other values that we might care about. The second is that the obsession with scale that's partly motivated by the structure of the venture capital industry means that we not only observe social harms in a small context, but these technologies are scaled up and come to dominate markets such that the social harms are broadly spread. And then the third piece of the puzzle is that government has very much been out of the game for the last 25 years, crafting a regulatory oasis around what's happening in tech. So if that is the system error, what does that actually mean in the context of algorithms? Well, this is what it means. It means that algorithmic decision-making, the use of these algorithmic tools, whether it's in the allocation of public services or in hiring processes or in criminal justice decision-making or healthcare decision-making, is very much a structure that optimizes for one particular end. That is the end goal, the predictive function of a machine learning tool. And the reality is that we need to recognize that whatever is being optimized for by the company is in tension potentially with other things that we care about. That you may get efficiency at some outcome, but there may be deeper concerns about whether the outcome that you're optimizing for is the outcome that is commonly agreed to, and whether you can protect things like both substantive fairness and procedural fairness. So let me give 3 quick examples. The algorithm that everyone knows about is the Facebook newsfeed, right? The idea that the curation of information in our broader information ecosystem is done for us by automated decision-making processes. And what's being optimized for in that context by the company is not the health of our information ecosystem or the health of our democracy. It's engagement with a product, which is Facebook. And so we are already seeing the tensions between Facebook's strategies around algorithmic decision-making and some of our broader social goals as we deal with issues like disinformation and misinformation. A second example comes from hiring. This is one of the things that we encounter with our students all the time. They are applying for jobs in companies that can't deal with the extraordinary volume of resumes that come. And so they're using automated decision-making systems to help make judgments about which students are worth interviewing and who's best equipped to perform well in the company. Well, Amazon, one of the most capable companies in the world, was using algorithmic decision-making tools to make hiring decisions and discovered that its decision-making tool was systematically biased against women. That the tool would basically identify in a resume anything that spoke to someone's gender identity and discount that candidate. On the basis of the historical experience in the company, those were candidates that were deemed less worthy. And no matter how much technical talent they threw at this problem, they could not erase gender discrimination in the algorithm. And that's because, as Ernestine suggests, the data generating process that produced the inputs for the algorithm was telling Amazon that it's a corporate culture in which men were doing a lot better than women. And as a result, learning from the past is actually going to reinforce those kinds of biases. And then the third example where I think all of these issues come to roost is the kind of decisions that we've had to confront in California about whether to replace a cash bail system with algorithmic decision-making about bail processes and whether people should be let out in advance of trial. And both through the legislative process in Sacramento, but also more recently through Proposition 25, voters are grappling with 2 of the most central issues when we think about algorithms and public policy. How do we ensure that algorithms that are designed treat people fairly, regardless of their identity? And then how also do we build a set of processes around algorithmic decision-making that ensure that people have transparency about the use of these tools, that these tools are audited and there's effective oversight over these tools, and that there's a sense of due process that you would expect if it was a human making decisions. How do you guarantee that when machines are making the decisions? So we are living this frontier now in California, and it's where these big issues that we describe in system error about optimization, about scale, about government needing to get in the game. This is one of the very concrete frontiers where these issues are being negotiated.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Jennifer Urban, who, as I mentioned before, is not only a professor of law, a clinical professor of law at UC Berkeley, but is also chair of the recently established, board chair of the recently established California Privacy Protection Agency. Jennifer, can you say a little bit more about the CPPA and how it came about? And also maybe to give us a sense of what this looks like compared to what we might find, say, in Europe or in other places.
Thank you, Karthik, very much. And I really appreciate the invitation from California 100. I think it is one of the great benefits of living in California and being a Californian that even if we don't always succeed, there is a real energy and a real impetus to try to think about problems in an expansive, inclusive way, in a long-term way. So I'm really especially pleased to be here. And thank you for the invitation and for the conversation. I do need to say that I am only speaking today for myself, not for the California Privacy Protection Agency or its board or the university. So today, Jeremy is the academic on our panel, and Ernestine is the practical business person on our panel, and I'm the person thinking about regulation as part of my work with CPPA. And I'm really excited to be here today because the California Privacy Protection Agency is implementing legislation does anticipate and provide for regulation related to algorithms and privacy. And it's one of the first, if not the first, law in the United States to do that. So because we are so new, I'll take a couple of minutes or a minute to introduce the CPPA and our implementing law to everyone, and then explain how we relate to some of the issues that Ernestine and Jeremy were talking about. So the California Privacy Protection Agency is brand new. It was created by the voters of California through Proposition 24, the California Privacy Rights Act, in November 2020. It is the first dedicated privacy agency with full administrative powers in the United States. There are agencies like this, data protection authorities, they're called, in Europe and in other places, but as far as we know, this is the first in the United States, so it's very exciting. The agency is charged with protecting the fundamental privacy rights of natural persons with respect to the use of their personal information by implementing the California Consumer Privacy Act. It also is to do its work with the goal of strengthening consumer privacy while giving attention to the impact on business and innovation. So there's sort of a balance built in, and that brings in, from the very beginning, the need for, in my view, again, this is my personal view, for the agency to consider carefully some of those competing values that Jeremy was talking about. Now, how does privacy relate to algorithms? The CPRA is quite forward-looking in its attention to algorithms and automated decision-making by giving attention both to the ways that consumers who seek to protect their privacy should be able to understand and make decisions about automated decisions made by algorithms, and how they actually might be able to use automated processes themselves to their benefit. The law recognizes the algorithmic nature of how consumer data is used today. As Jeremy was saying, there's scale. Things are automated. When we go online or we give our data over to order something, all of that data goes into a vast automated set of systems where it's shared and it's used in a variety of ways. And the new law recognizes that in a couple of important ways. First, it deals with something that it calls profiling. Profiling under the new law is any form of automated processing of personal information. And personal information is widely defined information about you that could identify you or relates to you in some way that people tend to think is important for privacy. And it's processing that personal information to evaluate aspects related to the person and to analyze or predict things about that person. And then the law gives examples, performance at work, health, interests, right, to decide whether to serve ads at you often, reliability, behavior, the economic situation, and that kind of thing. So you can see that profiling is defined by the law, ties directly to some of the examples that Jeremy gave about algorithms making decisions that might be in conflict with some of our values. So the law initially works in the concept of profiling as part of its overall rubric. And then it also directs the agency, which has rulemaking authority, to create rules that govern consumer rights with respect to automated decision-making, access to information about it, the right to opt out of automated decision-making, and importantly, and this is something that Jeremy sort of alluded to but didn't mention directly, being able to get meaningful information about the logic involved in those decisions. One of the things about algorithmic decision-making is that it's often opaque to people about whom the decisions are made. And sometimes, depending on the sophistication and the type of algorithm, it may also be opaque to the people who created it. As Jeremy described in the example about the discriminatory employment algorithm couldn't be made non-discriminatory, sometimes it's not so easy to figure out what's going on. But often what people need is some information about the logic so that they can understand what they think about that decision. And the agency is currently thinking about these things under the direction of the law in order to create regulations to empower consumers and to guide businesses as they think about how they want to use algorithms and how they want to do that fairly. Now, I also said that the law anticipates consumers being able to use automated decision-making or automated systems in their benefit as well. In addition to the opt-out for algorithmic decision-making, more generally, the law allows Californians to opt out of the use of their data in a variety of ways. It does recognize that things are of a vast scale and automated today by providing for the possibility of what's called an opt-out preference signal, or an automated signal that a consumer could set, and that would automatically communicate with businesses and say, hey, I want to opt out of you selling my personal information under the law. This is already in the current regulations, but it is something that the new law updates and that the agency is thinking about. So there are a number of ways in which California is leading here. We have the first agency focused on these issues. We have the first, or some of the first, algorithmic, the first instance of embedding algorithmic decision-making into the law and asking for regulations. And we are currently working on that. Now, Karthik mentioned that Europe is a comparison point. The General Data Protection Regulation does have limitations on algorithmic decision-making, including prohibiting it for a number of reasons, and allowing for contesting certain decisions. And there is, at the moment, Europe is undergoing discussion of a broader ranging regulation related to algorithms. And the new law here in California, the CPRA, echoes some of the GDPR and the European model. But in some ways, it adds fewer limitations to what the agency can do to regulate the algorithms. And in some ways, it's not as detailed as the European regulations. So I'd be happy to talk about all of this in Q&A. I just wanted folks to have a bit of a background and understand that they have these rights, and they will have more information about their rights as the agency continues its rulemaking, for which there will be lots of opportunity to weigh in, and we hope you will.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. And as they say, good luck with the new role and the new leadership role. Ernestine, I'm going to bring you back in here and maybe, not frame this up in too dire of a way, but, often we hear from industry that, we need to make sure, right, that the cure is not worse than the disease, that in the zeal towards regulation, that we do not kill innovation. This is especially in a state like California, where we've had a favorable set of circumstances that have enabled a certain, technology development, science and technology R&D to thrive. So what are the things that you think we should be, that you worry about, or things that we should be thinking about to make sure that if we even do something that is kind of maybe strengthening the regulatory hand, that we don't risk the kind of innovation that we've built in California so far?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I think there is definitely an intricate balance between how do you rein in companies without discouraging innovation. Jennifer, of course, mentioned Europe and GDPR, and there's fairly steep penalties if companies don't adhere to that. They have to report breaches within 72 hours. Now they have this AIA, Artificial Intelligence Act, that outright bans some use cases of AI. But I think one thing that's interesting to note, just to kind of provide a contrarian perspective, is none of the global tech giants like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Alibaba, or Tencent are European. When you contrast that with China, not saying that this is the perfect model that does exist in China, but laws in China are a lot more relaxed as kind of the extreme other end. They use facial recognition on citizens, and Chinese companies work a lot more closely with the government Alibaba and JD.com, two companies in China, transformed the ecosystem completely. There was an instance in which more than a third of the approximately 6 million stores in China were transformed in less than 2 years by these two companies, offering digital tools and AI tools for free. But I think looking at it from a more broader perspective, I think there's two things, which is one, you don't want government jumping ahead without understanding technology. And then two, you also don't want government to be too slow on regulation. So on the first point, in terms of jumping ahead, I think about the history of car regulation. And in the late 1800s or so, there was this act in the UK that basically required anything that was a mechanically propelled vehicle to be manned by at least two people, had a max speed of, I think it was like 10 miles per hour on certain roads, or like 2 miles when passing through towns. And the regulations were designed for not for car inventors, but that's obviously a problem when you think about innovation and government not understanding technology and innovation. But then on the other hand, you don't want government to be too slow. So when you think about radiation exposure, and that causes an increased risk of risk for cancer, genetic defects, and whatnot. But there were products that were still on the market that exposed consumers to this even after researchers and scientists had discovered this. So I think an instance of government acting too slow. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's the big question of how do you allow new technologies, businesses to innovate, thrive, but also balance the public good, consumer wants, worker welfare, the interests, innovations of the private sector at the same time. So I think it's an intricate balance.
I'm glad you mentioned automobiles, and folks, I just had to put on some headphones because there's some loud landscapers right next door. So hopefully you're able to hear me. Okay. I think about, the Clean Air Act, Ernestine, and kind of California's, fuel standards, right? Emission standards. And, this has been a point of contention if we think not like California is not an island, and, you have federal regulation. And that's an instance in which California has consistently set the high bar. Sometimes industry folks have like howled in protests, but it seems to have been able to adapt over time, and there are a bunch of states that follow California's lead. But even in thinking something like that, I mean, is there a certain way that we need to think about regulation that doesn't get too far ahead of the technology? Because you don't want to set up an impossible task for industry to hit.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think regulation definitely has to be collaborative as well as adaptive. Collaborative in the standpoint of it definitely has to be co-developed with key stakeholders. So speaking with industry when developing regulation, but then also adaptive on that front in terms of, especially with innovation changing at such a rapid pace, being able to revisit the regulation, say every 5 years, or having some sort of automatic review process on that front, since otherwise it's government just making a decision and it's not going to work out for industry.
Thank you, Ernestine. Jeremy, Jennifer, wondering if you want to weigh in on this kind of bigger question, like stepping outside of algorithms. Jeremy, you have other chapters in your book.
I
I'm sure you have
want to
something
jump
to
in
say.
on this, Karthick. So, one of the things that I do at Stanford is I teach about 350 students a year in our kind of ethics, public policy, and technology class. Most of them are CS majors. And I feel like our first responsibility in this class is to do away with binary notions of you can either have regulation and kind of the public interest met, or you can have innovation. And I think often we're pushing back against a sort of false narrative that the effective functioning of the innovation economy and the effective functioning of our markets or in general depends on there being no regulation whatsoever. When of course the reality is that regulation is just another word for the decisions that we make in our democratic politics to institute guardrails or safeguards in the functioning of markets. And so I'll engage students and I'll say, did you get sick drinking milk this morning? And the answer is no. And well, why do you think you didn't get sick drinking milk this morning? Because we actually have an oversight structure, for food safety. Are you getting a rash when you wear clothes that are produced either in the United States or overseas? The answer is no, because we have a set of regulatory guardrails in place when we import products. And I think those who are arguing for things like what Jennifer is driving in California are trying to bring the tech sector into the same space that almost every other sector of our economy is, which is recognizing that the unconstrained decisions of companies on their own and investors who invest in companies is not achieving or striking the right balance between that which benefits the private sector in terms of the growth of these companies and other things that are at stake. And so point number one is regulation always underlies markets. And so the question is, what kind of regulation do we want to have? Not is regulation a good thing or a bad thing? The second thing, just to say, Karthick, and I think it's really important, I'd be interested in hearing Ernestine's view on this. The pressure for regulation in part comes from the fact that companies have not done a good job of balancing their own interests against a set of broader public interests, right? So you gave the example of the Clean Air Act. You can think about the Clean Water Act as well. The externalities of company production in the pollution of air and water were what necessitated government action. But at a time when people are now abundantly aware of fairness and bias concerns in algorithmic decision-making, or interpretability and due process concerns of the sort that Jennifer described, concerns about the implications of the automation of the workforce for people's ability to access meaningful work that helps them meet their basic needs. As you think about all of these trade-offs that are embedded in our technological moment, I look first to companies to do a better job of navigating these trade-offs, to make explicit the values that are being traded off in their own design processes, and to think about what stakeholders they need to engage as they decide how to tune their systems. It's in a world in which companies are not even attentive to these trade-offs that regulation becomes the only alternative. And so I think as we think about California going forward in the leadership role of our companies, there's an opportunity to really cultivate a professional ethic around responsible AI that is far more attuned to these issues, even in the absence of the work that Jennifer and team will be doing at the state level, or that which may happen at the federal level.
So let's quickly, I'll go back to Ernestine to get her thoughts, and then we'll go to Jennifer. Ernestine, what are you seeing, within industry itself, right? Tech ethics classes, I'm sure, are not as prevalent as bioethics classes are, in our professional schools and engineering programs. But the thing that Jeremy's saying, it's really companies should be doing better, future entrepreneurs, startups. You're in VC, how much of these ethics conversations come up in the kinds of investment conversations that happen around the table?
Mm-hmm. I think unfortunately the conversation doesn't happen that much, but I do recognize that it is important. I think I'll provide a few different perspectives on this. I think one, if you think about, let's just say biases in algorithms, and let's use Siri, Alexa as an example. My parents, they have accents when they speak English, for instance, and Siri and Alexa can't recognize voice commands from certain accents. But then if you think about that being a problem with the products, you do need a lot of audio samples to train a machine to recognize speech, and at the end of the day, an AI can only recognize what's been trained to hear. So if the training data doesn't have voices with accents, obviously that's a problem. From a business standpoint, of course, it's really costly to collect this sort of additional training data. Personally, I'm of the perspective that there's obviously moral reasons to tackle these sorts of problems. That's really clear. I think we'll all agree on that. From a business standpoint, there are reasons in my mind that I think are valid from a business standpoint on why you should be addressing this. One, in terms of just winning over consumer trust. So if you think about autonomous vehicles and future deployment of AVs, if you can't trust an autonomous vehicle and that you can't understand and explain why it gets involved in accidents or makes other traffic decisions. I think that'll be a challenge for the rollout of AVs. Obviously, like attracting, retaining employees is a big challenge. There was, the relatively big news development when the lead of Google's AI ethics team left. And then I think also just on the regulatory front, from a company standpoint, it is important to stay ahead of legal changes that do occur.
Great. Thank you, Ernestine. One thing you brought up, and something Jennifer had brought up, and you brought up so much, Jennifer, but I want to get into this. One of the things you said is to empower consumers to better understand automated decision-making technology and processes. It's not word for word, but that's what I got out of it. How can either the CPPA or just California in general improve the extent to which consumers can understand what, by design is a pretty complicated and technical product?
Absolutely. First, though, I would like to weigh in on the regulatory stuff since I'm the regulatory person. I hear a lot to agree with, both from Jeremy and Ernestine. And again, remembering that I'm speaking just for myself, this is how I see the benefit. This is how I see regulation operating in the space of data privacy and algorithms related to data privacy, which is to construct guardrails that allow a robust market to develop for products and services that embed the values that the Democratic polity has said that they want to embed through the proposition. So regulations may diminish companies' ability to pursue a market in a certain way, but they open up other abilities to pursue markets in another way. And one of the most important functions of regulations, from my own perspective, is to set sort of the basic standards so that the market is developing in a way that reflects the needs and desires of the consumers and the polity, by which I just mean the citizenry and the residents of California, whether or not they're using some of these products. That doesn't mean that it isn't a challenge. Ernestine brought up some really important points about the need to engage with business stakeholders in order to understand, what is the technology? What is the business model? What would we break something if we did this way? And maybe it is something that needs to be broken. Again, this is just me. I'm not presaging anything, but it would need to be it should be something that we understand that we're doing. And equally, and even more so given our charter to protect the fundamental privacy rights of natural persons, is to inclusively engage Californians to understand what their needs are. And then it will be the agency's job to balance all of that in order to try to embed the values in the system as directed by the law. And of course, the law is quite clear on some of the things that we should do. I don't mean that we don't have unfettered discretion, but thinking about developing a set of regulations that allow for the flourishing of a lot of existing business models and maybe new business models is actually one point of regulation. And then in terms of empowering consumers, in my own research, before I took on this position, one of the things that was very apparent was a real sense of not just unease, but real unhappiness and a lack of trust with regards to both companies and the government when it came to handling people's personal information. At the time that I initially started this research with my co-author, Chris Hufnagel, the story was still a lot of, well, people don't choose privacy, so they don't care about it. But it was clear that that was not true. That people didn't feel like they understood what was happening, and they didn't feel like they had a real choice. So one of the main things that the CCPA, and now expanded and amended by the CPRA, does is to try to provide meaningful choice. And in order to have meaningful choice, consumers need to have meaningful information. So one of the things that everyone has the right to do under the law as a Californian is to access information that companies have about you, and in order to understand what it is they have and what they're doing with it. So then you can make a choice within the constraints of the law if you would like to do that.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Next question that I have as a follow-up is, we can think about, regulation, and I don't want to say but. So regulation in addition to other things, including, the kind of the mindsets and motivations, when we talk about guardrails, we can think about policy guardrails, but there's ethical guardrails, there's like investment guardrails, et cetera, right? Policies maybe outside of government too, right? As well as practices, norms, et cetera. Now, with all of that, at least in my mind, as someone who specializes in civic engagement and specializes in ensuring inclusion, all of these protections don't, and even reducing barriers don't necessarily get people engaged, informed, empowered, right? So what should we be thinking about in terms of active processes of inclusion, and who should be doing it? And I'm sure there's not just one answer, but I'll throw it up to anyone. I see Jeremy nodding his head a little bit, so I'm just going to call on Jeremy. So Jeremy, what would you say in terms of having this kind of active inclusion process?
Well, I love that you raised this point, Karthick, and part of the reason I'm so excited about this panel discussion is that I think California really is a laboratory for how we build a technological future that better balances the interests of sort of corporations that are driving innovation, but also citizens who are affected by these technologies, not just consumers, but citizens more broadly. And I think Jennifer's spoken powerfully to what that looks like in the context of some of the legislation that we have out there. My own view is that using California as that laboratory has massive knock-on effects for every other state in the United States, for other markets in which technologies are sold, and that we've been in a moment where the US has largely been responsive to Europe, but with California's leadership, we'll be in a position, I think, to really shape the incentives of policymakers in Washington and the incentives of companies who will look for some regulatory standardization as places like the EU and California continue to lead. So that's a huge opportunity. And then that comes to your question, Karthick, is who has to be involved in that conversation? And I guess it's very clear to me right now, the mechanism that isn't working on its own, which is sort of straight up referenda on these issues, sort of point by point. If we look at what played out in the debates around the algorithmic decision-making in criminal justice and the end of cash bail, or the vote on the proposition related to the treatment of gig workers, we know that our ballot system is one that is hugely influenced by a small number of players, and that the mobilization of capital and the shaping of public opinion that then leads to these up or down votes is often captured by a set of interests. Now, of course, the ballot propositions also enabled, Jennifer's organization to come to fruition. But I think what you're calling for is a much deeper conversation that engages citizens in weighing these values. And that begins with education on these issues. That's why we're doing what we're doing at Stanford. And I know colleagues are doing similar things at other institutions across the state, which is we need people who are building technology, but also people who are impacted by technology to really understand these issues and understand what the trade-offs are. We also need our technologists to take ownership of these issues and not, be hiding and cowering with and playing behind the scenes with respect to the threat of regulation, but really engaging frontally in the same way that we saw Brad Smith do from Microsoft a couple of years ago, or Snapchat has done in the most recent period around content moderation, leaning into the issues that are at stake and really putting their own starting positions out there for public debate. And then I think you've seen this around things like automated vehicles, facial recognition technologies, and the like. We need to bring these conversations to the local level. It's in cities, it's in counties where people interact with technology, where they have a more direct relationship with their government, where I think people can get really mobilized and energized to think about how they want to trade off these values. But the answer is, Karthick, it's got to be a ton of experiments and participation, because we know how hard it is to get people energized to engage at all. And because these issues are technical, and because these issues are distant from most people, even though the consequences are felt by them, we're going to have to work doubly hard to create these opportunities for engagement.
Thank you, Jeremy. And you had mentioned citizenship. Jennifer had mentioned citizenship, so I can't resist. As a recent author who wrote this book, Citizenship Reimagined. Now, it's not the full scope of what we mean by citizenship, but I don't think either you or Jennifer meant we're talking about U.S. citizens here, right? And in fact, we have an incredible opportunity to really unpack what does California citizenship mean. In our book, we talk about it as a set of rights, but we can think about corporate citizenship. We can think about citizenship at that local level. And that's not just something involving government, right, the state, as it were, and individuals, but also corporations, philanthropy, community organizations, faith-based organizations, and the like. So we're approaching towards the end here, but as people think about kind of their wishes and hopes for the future of California, either specifically when we think about algorithms and the future of algorithms, or just more generally, right, of the kind of future we're building, would love to hear your thoughts about this notion of not only guardrails and protection, but this kind of active notion of participation, engagement, and citizenship and shaping our future, and maybe even fighting for that future if that future, the ideals that we're looking for, is under risk. So I'll ask Jennifer to start, and I'll go to Ernestine, and I'll go to Jeremy. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm really glad that we're closing on this, which is so important. Yes, I said citizen and then I said resident, because I did want to be clear that the law that I work with at the moment protects all Californians. And that's very important. And all Californians have a stake in all of these discussions. I would second everything that Jeremy said earlier, and only add to it that in addition to helping people learn, I think it's crucially important for institutions, by which I mean agencies like mine and other agencies, but also companies, also nonprofits, many of whom are doing this, agencies are too, is to listen. And that is, as you know very well, Karthick, that is crucially important, and it is hard because for all of the reasons that we've discussed, that people have a lot of priorities, they have lives. Asking people to participate in something like this is asking something of them. And I think it's important that we recognize that, and that we work very hard to try to get as broad a range of voices as possible. Even if people don't have an opinion on the technological niceties, people can say what their values are, and they can say what their concerns are in general, and they can explain how they interact with these technologies, how they interact with these various services and products, and what their experience is. And that is crucially important, because I don't think we always, when I say we, I just mean people who are in a position to do regulation, or people who are building the products, don't always understand what is actually going on with the people who are experiencing all of this on a day-to-day basis. And that is crucially important in order for whatever decisions we make to go forward for the next 5 years or whatever it is, to reflect what the needs of Californians really are.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Ernestine, you're a commissioner on California 100.
Mhm.
What are the things that you think we need to be focused on, but also that you wish for, in terms of California's long-term future?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think we all have our individual roles in terms of arguably, like government has the ability and responsibility to safeguard and further the public good. Industry has a responsibility to develop products and tools that are not only efficient, but also safe, privacy respecting, secure, minimize biases. But I think at the end of the day, we do need to have, and I think both Jennifer and Jeremy alluded to this, all stakeholders involved, whether it's engineers, designers, policymakers, consumers, everyone in the room together, engaged in considering both the pros and cons of issues like data collection, algorithms, tech regulation, and whatnot. So I am glad that for today's panel, we do have such a diverse set of perspectives, both from government to the academic perspective. So I think there's a lot more that we still need to do.
Great. Thank you, Ernestine. And Jeremy, over to you. Your hopes and wishes, but not, and what are the things we need to work for, right, to make that kind of those dreams and visions a reality?
So I have a high level goal and then a very concrete goal. The high level goal is to recognize that our technological future is the responsibility of our democracy and not the responsibility of CEOs or the responsibility of engineers on their own. And I think the passivity with which most people have treated the impacts of technology on society has got to be broken up and turned into a real energy and passion for thinking about the kind of technological future that we want to live in. And that means exercising our democratic muscles. The very specific thing, and it goes back to something that Ernestine said at the outset, it's a little bit about this like Goldilocks. We need, regulation at the right time, not too early, not too late, and we need just the right amount of regulation. And I think one of the things that we're all grappling with is the limits of our existing institutional models for regulating sectors that are as fast changing and technically sophisticated as we confront with high tech in California and in the United States. And so one of the things that I hope comes from your 100-year vision and the kinds of experiments that you're going to run in the coming years is to think about what regulatory models look like that arrive at that Goldilocks kind of outcome that Ernestine is describing, and what that means in terms of building stakeholder systems, in terms of engaging technologists in the design of regulations, in terms of thinking about rolling out regulations, but being able to learn and pivot really quickly. Because we know from the history of regulation that we usually don't end up in that Goldilocks moment. We're usually too early or we're too late. Often we're too late and lots of social harm has been done. And so let's see Stanford as a laboratory, not just for experimenting with what the regulations are, but experimenting with how we regulate. And how we regulate in a way that involves all stakeholders, is inclusive, and enables us to learn and pivot quickly.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. And in addition to Stanford, I would say not only the University of California system, but all of the incredible talent that we have. And I'll just end with some notes of reflection. California 100 is less than a year old in terms of even in its quiet phase. And we launched publicly in July. It's just been incredible with the kinds of deep and impactful conversations we've had one-on-one and small groups, to be able to have a public forum like this, and this being our first forum, to think and dream. And also to have, there's anxieties too, right? And making sure that we're addressing the kinds of problems we're seeing cropping up right now so that we can ensure a more inclusive, sustainable, and equitable future. Thank you to all the speakers for joining us today. This is the first, well, maybe not the first step, but some of the early steps in a pretty long but rapidly moving journey that California 100 is going to be engaging in over the next year and a half. We encourage you to go to our website, california100.org. You can see us on social, which is based on algorithms, of course. But there's some good that comes out of the algorithms you'll be entering into. But really, we are in the process of doing a lot of innovation projects. There's various issue reports, including on the future, long-term future of advanced technology and basic research in California, that we'll be releasing later in the spring. So we encourage you to join us at future events, learning opportunities. We're going to have various listening sessions as well as deliberation events throughout the year. So we invite you to join us, and hopefully some of those will be in real life and not behind a tablet screen or a computer screen. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Speakers, thank you so much for your thoughtful and responsive conversation. Often people come in with their talking points, you ask a question and they don't really answer the question, but it's just a real pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you for everyone in our audience who are either watching this live or who might watch this later. And shoot us an email, info@california100.org, or through various social platforms. We'd love to hear from you, not only with how things went today, but on the issues that we're talking about and the kinds of things we need to prioritize in future conversations. So thank you, everyone, and Happy New Year.